They say Christmas is a season of joy, of candles, hymns, and laughter around the hearth. But in the Morton household, every Christmas was marked not by bells but by a funeral toll. Between 1841 and 1845, the four Morton sisters each died on Christmas Eve, leaving only one behind. What curse could take a family apart, one holy night at a time? And why did no one in the village dare to question it until it was far too late? Tonight we descend into the shadows of Dorsetshire, where winter winds carry more than snow, where silence holds secrets that demand to be told, where four sisters learned that some traditions are written in blood. But before we begin, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt death watching you, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Keep that feeling close. You'll need it where we're going. In the bleak winter of 1841, frost clung to the windows of Morton Manor like desperate fingers. The house stood proud on its hill, overlooking the village of Little Harwick with the cold dignity of old money and older secrets. Stone walls that had weathered centuries of storms, halls that echoed with the footsteps of generations, and within those walls, a family bound by more than blood. The Morton sisters. Four names spoken with reverence in the village below: Eleanor, Margaret, Clara, and Ruth. Each as different as the seasons, yet connected by invisible threads that would soon begin to fray. Eleanor, at 24, was winter herself, sharp-edged and beautiful, with eyes like chips of blue ice. She moved through the manor as though she owned not just its rooms but the very air within them. The eldest daughter of a respected family, she carried authority like a crown, heavy, glittering, and sometimes cutting those who came too close. Margaret followed at 22, her mind as quick as her tongue was sharp. Where Eleanor ruled through presence, Margaret commanded through intellect. She read voraciously, wrote letters to correspondents in London, and spoke of women's rights with a passion that made the village matrons whisper behind their fans. In her amber eyes burned an ambition that seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of Dorsetshire. Then came Clara, 20 years old and gentle as morning mist. Where her sisters were forces of nature, Clara was poetry made flesh. She painted watercolors of the moors, played piano with fingers that seemed to capture melancholy itself, and possessed a kindness so pure it almost hurt to witness. Yet beneath that gentleness lay something fragile, something that trembled at loud voices and harsh words. And Ruth, sweet, 16-year-old Ruth, still caught between childhood and womanhood. Her laughter could fill the manor's vast halls. Her curiosity led her into every dusty corner and forgotten room. She alone seemed untouched by the shadows that danced at the edges of the family portrait. Their father, Charles Morton, ruled his household with the same iron discipline he'd once brought to his military service. Widowed young, he'd raised his daughters with strict adherence to duty, God, and family honor. His hair had turned silver early, his back remained military straight, and his word was law within the stone walls of their ancestral home. Mrs. Redfern had served the family for 40 years, watching the girls grow from babies to women. Her weathered hands had braided their hair, mended their dresses, and whispered old stories when their father wasn't listening. Stories of the moors, of ancient grudges, of things that walked when good Christian folk were safe in their beds. As Christmas approached that year, the manor hummed with familiar traditions. Holly and ivy were gathered from the grounds, candles were set in every window. The great dining room was prepared for their annual feast, a tradition that brought neighbors, church elders, and distant relatives under their roof to celebrate the season of light. But something felt different that Christmas Eve. The very air seemed to hold its breath. The family gathered around the ancient oak table, candlelight dancing across their faces as they joined hands for prayer. Eleanor's voice rang clear as church bells as she led them in gratitude for another year, another blessing, another gathering of their clan. "Lord, we thank thee for thy bounty," she began, her words echoing in the vaulted ceiling above, and then she stopped. Her hand clasped in Margaret's began to tremble. Her eyes widened, not with reverence, but with terror. She tried to speak again, but only a choking sound emerged from her throat. "Eleanor." Charles's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She convulsed. Her body arched backward with inhuman force, her chair clattering to the stone floor. Foam appeared on her lips. Her eyes rolled back until only white showed, and still she thrashed as though fighting an invisible enemy. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. Eleanor Morton lay still on the cold stone floor, her blue eyes staring sightlessly at the rafters above, the Christmas feast forgotten, the candles guttering in their holders, the family huddled around her lifeless form. The doctor came within the hour, his face grave as he examined the body. "A weak heart," he pronounced finally, though his eyes avoided meeting Charles's gaze. "The excitement of the season, perhaps. These things happen to delicate constitutions." But the villagers who'd witnessed it whispered different words. "Poison," some said. "Curse," whispered others. The way she'd seized, the way her eyes had looked, as though she'd seen something that no living soul should witness. Charles forbade such talk. He demanded silence, respect, and proper mourning. The Morton name would not be tarnished by superstition and gossip. Eleanor would be buried with dignity, and life would continue as it always had. Yet as the family retired that night, as servants extinguished candles and locked doors, something had changed in Morton Manor. The first crack had appeared in foundations that had stood for centuries. And Ruth, lying in her bed with tears still wet on her cheeks, began to dream. Dreams of Eleanor, in her white nightgown pale as moonlight, standing at the foot of her bed. Eleanor's mouth moved, but no sound came. She pointed with one pale finger toward something Ruth couldn't see, her face twisted with urgency. Ruth woke with a gasp, her heart racing. The room was empty, the shadows nothing more than furniture draped in darkness, but the dream felt real, more real than the waking world. She pulled her blanket closer and tried to forget, but Eleanor's pointing finger remained burned into her mind's eye, pointing toward something, or someone. "Tell me, have you ever had a dream so vivid it felt like a warning? A glimpse of something terrible approaching, unstoppable as winter itself?" Because Ruth's dream was only the beginning. And what Eleanor was pointing toward, well, that would become clear soon enough. But not soon enough to save the next sister. 12 months can pass like pages in a book, but in Morton Manor that year stretched like a wound that refused to heal. Eleanor's death had left more than an empty chair at the dining table. It had left a question mark hanging over the family like a storm cloud that never quite broke. Margaret stepped into her sister's role with the efficiency of a general assuming command. She managed the household accounts, corresponded with their father's business associates, and spoke for the family when visitors called. But there was something different about her now, something harder. The villagers noticed it first, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, the way she seemed to measure every word before speaking it. "She's too eager," Mrs. Whitmore from the bakery whispered to her neighbor. "Too quick to take Eleanor's place. It's not natural." Such whispers followed Margaret wherever she went. When she organized charity for the poor, they said she was trying to buy respectability. When she improved the estate's efficiency, they claimed she'd always coveted control. The same intelligence that had once impressed me now seemed calculated, suspect. Ruth noticed the change too, though she couldn't name it. Margaret had always been sharp, but now she was sharp in a different way, like a blade that had been honed too often until it could cut without meaning to. Clara withdrew deeper into herself, spending hours at the piano or in the conservatory with her paints. Her watercolors grew darker, depicting bare trees against gray skies, empty moors stretching into mist. When Ruth asked about them, Clara would only smile sadly and say, "I paint what I see, dear sister." But what did she see? Ruth began to wonder. because sometimes she caught Clara staring at empty corners, her face pale with something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. As autumn turned to winter, and Christmas approached once more, a nervous energy filled the manor. The servants moved more quietly, spoke in whispers, and jumped at sudden sounds. Redfern began muttering prayers under her breath as she worked, her gnarled fingers constantly worrying at the wooden cross she wore around her neck. "It's the anniversary," she explained when Ruth questioned her. "Death remembers its appointments, child. It always comes calling when it's expected." Charles forbade such talk, of course. He'd grown even more rigid in the year since Eleanor's death, more insistent on proper behavior, proper thoughts, proper prayers. The family would observe Christmas as they always had, with dignity, gratitude, and absolute faith in God's plan. But Ruth had her own concerns. The dreams hadn't stopped. Eleanor appeared to her regularly now, always in that white nightgown, always pointing. Sometimes she seemed to be trying to speak, her mouth forming urgent, soundless words. And lately, Margaret had begun appearing in the dreams too, standing beside Eleanor with the same pale, desperate expression. Ruth tried to tell Clara about the visions, but her gentle sister only patted her hand and spoke of grief taking strange forms. "The mind sees what the heart needs," Clara said softly. "Perhaps Eleanor visits because you miss her so." But Ruth knew it wasn't comfort Eleanor brought, it was a warning. Christmas Eve arrived with a bitter wind that rattled the windows and sent smoke back down the chimney. The family gathered again in the great dining room, but the feast felt different this year. Smaller, quieter, a memorial as much as a celebration. Margaret had arranged everything with meticulous care. The finest china, the best silver, candles casting warm light over faces that seemed too pale, too watchful. She'd even placed Eleanor's photograph at her old seat, draped with black ribbon and white roses. "We gather to remember," Margaret began, her voice steady as she raised her wine glass, "to honor Eleanor's memory and celebrate another year of God's grace." The family murmured agreement, lifting their glasses in unison. But as Margaret brought the wine to her lips, something changed in her expression. Her eyes widened, pupils dilating as though she'd seen something in the wine's dark surface. "Margaret." Ruth's voice sounded small in the vast room. Margaret's hand flew to her throat. The wine glass shattered on the stone floor, dark liquid spreading like blood between the fragments. She tried to speak, but only a choking sound emerged, the same sound Eleanor had made exactly 1 year before. She clawed at her neck as though invisible fingers were tightening around it. Her face turned purple. Her eyes bulged with terror and confusion. She staggered backward, knocking over her chair, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Charles leaped to his feet, reaching for his daughter, but Margaret was beyond help. She convulsed once, twice, then collapsed across the table, her dark hair spilling into the candlelight like spilled ink. The doctor's verdict was the same as before. Nervous failure, the strain of managing the household perhaps, or grief taking its toll on a sensitive constitution. But Ruth saw something else in the man's eyes as he packed his bag: fear. The same fear she'd glimpsed in the servants' faces, in the villagers' whispered conversations, in Clara's increasingly pale complexion. 2 sisters, 2 Christmas Eves, 2 deaths that made no sense. As Margaret's body was carried from the room, Ruth caught sight of Mrs. Redfern crossing herself in the doorway. The old woman's lips moved in what might have been prayer, but Ruth caught the words she whispered: "The old blood debt comes due." That night, as the house settled into mourning silence once more, Ruth's dreams were more vivid than ever. Eleanor and Margaret stood together now, their white nightgowns stirring in an unfelt breeze. They pointed with 4 pale hands toward the same spot, their mouths moving in desperate synchronization. Ruth woke with their soundless words echoing in her mind, and for the first time she thought she understood what they were trying to say. They weren't pointing at something, they were pointing at someone. At Clara, sleeping peacefully in the next room, unaware that her name had just been written in an appointment book that death never lost. Do you believe in patterns, in the terrible mathematics of fate? Because Ruth was beginning to see the equation that governed her family's destruction. 2 sisters down, 2 remaining, and Christmas would come again, as inevitable as winter itself. The question that would haunt her through the coming year was simple. Could a pattern be broken, or was Clara already marked, already chosen, already lost? The year that followed Margaret's death was like watching a beautiful painting slowly fade in sunlight. Clara, once the embodiment of gentle grace, began to wither in ways that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with dread. She stopped painting. Her watercolors sat abandoned in the conservatory, brushes hardened with dried paint, canvases half-finished and forgotten. When Ruth asked why, Clara simply stared out at the moors with haunted eyes and whispered, "What's the point of creating beauty when everything dies?" The village children had begun a cruel game. They would walk past the manor gates and chant in sing-song voices, "Eleanor's gone, Margaret too, Clara next, then Ruth, then who?" Their laughter carried on the wind like the cawing of crows, and Clara would flinch each time she heard it, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as though it could shield her from fate itself. Sleep became Clara's enemy. She would lie awake until the early hours, listening to every creak of the old house, every sigh of wind through the eaves. When exhaustion finally claimed her, she would wake screaming, clutching Ruth's hand and babbling about voices in the walls. "They sing to me," Clara whispered one particularly dark night, her fingernails digging into Ruth's palm. "Eleanor and Margaret, they sing Christmas carols, but the words are all wrong. Instead of silent night, they sing final night. Instead of come, all ye faithful, they sing come, all ye fated." Ruth wanted to dismiss it as hysteria, but she'd begun hearing things too. Faint melodies drifting through the manor after midnight, voices that sounded familiar but sang words that made her skin crawl. She never told Clara about her own experiences. Her sister was fragile enough without confirmation that the nightmare was spreading. Charles dealt with Clara's deterioration the only way he knew how, through discipline and prayer. He instituted longer morning prayers, evening prayers, prayers before meals that stretched on until the food grew cold. He forbade Clara from speaking of visions or voices, threatening to send her to an asylum if she continued spreading unholy fantasies. But prayer seemed to make things worse. The more they knelt in the family chapel, the more Clara trembled. The louder Charles's voice rose in supplication, the paler Clara became. It was as though their devotion was summoning something that fed on faith itself. Mrs. Redfern watched it all with knowing eyes. She began leaving small charms around Clara's room, iron nails, sprigs of rowan, circles of salt that Charles would discover and sweep away in fury. But the old housekeeper was persistent, replacing them as quickly as they were removed. "Iron keeps them at bay," she whispered to Ruth when they were alone. "But only for so long. The debt must be paid, child. The old ways demand their due." "What debt?" Ruth demanded, but Mrs. Redfern would only shake her head and mutter about the sins of fathers and daughters who pay the price. As autumn deepened into winter, Clara began to waste away. She picked at her food, barely slept, and spoke in whispers when she spoke at all. Her once bright eyes dulled to the color of storm clouds, and her skin took on the translucent quality of fine porcelain. The worst part was her smile. When visitors called fewer and fewer as word spread through the county, Clara would smile with perfect politeness. But it was the smile of someone already dead, going through the motions of living out of habit rather than hope. December arrived like a funeral shroud. The servants began giving notice, claiming urgent family business or better positions elsewhere. In truth, they were fleeing. Everyone in Little Harwick knew what Christmas Eve meant for the Morton family, and none wanted to witness the third act of whatever tragedy was playing out in the manor on the hill. Clara seemed to accept her fate with the resignation of a condemned prisoner. She made her will, leaving her few personal possessions to Ruth. She wrote letters to distant relatives, polite farewells that read like obituaries written by the soon-to-be deceased. She even chose her burial dress, a white silk gown their mother had worn, preserved in lavender and hope. "You mustn't blame yourself," she told Ruth on the morning of December 23rd. "Whatever happens tomorrow night, it isn't your fault. Promise me you'll remember that." Ruth wanted to scream, to shake her sister, to demand that she fight. But Clara had already surrendered to whatever force was picking them off one by one. She moved through that final day like a ghost haunting her own life. Christmas Eve dinner was a mockery of their former celebrations. Just 3 family members at a table set for 4, Eleanor's and Margaret's photographs watching over them like patron saints of the doomed. Charles attempted grace, but his voice cracked on the familiar words. Clara sat silent, her untouched plate growing cold before her. The clock in the hall began its countdown to midnight, each chime echoing through the house like a heartbeat slowing toward death. At 15 minutes to 12, Clara pushed back from the table and stood on unsteady legs. "They're calling me," she said simply. "Eleanor and Margaret. They're waiting." Charles commanded her to sit, to pray, to fight whatever delusion gripped her mind. But Clara was beyond earthly authority now. She walked to the great windows that overlooked the moors, her white dress ghostly in the candlelight. At precisely midnight, she began to scream. Not the scream of pain or fear, but something far worse, the sound of a soul being torn from its moorings. Clara's body convulsed as though invisible hands were pulling her in different directions. Her eyes rolled back, showing only white, and her mouth opened impossibly wide. Then she was dancing to music only she could hear, spinning and leaping with inhuman grace, while her screams never ceased. Her feet barely touched the floor as she whirled through the room like a marionette controlled by a mad puppeteer. The dance lasted exactly 13 minutes. Then Clara collapsed like a broken doll, her limbs twisted at impossible angles, her eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. But on her face was an expression of such profound relief that it was almost beautiful. She was free from fear, from waiting, from the terrible burden of knowing that death was coming, free to join her sisters in whatever realm awaited the Morton daughters. As Charles knelt beside Clara's body, sobbing prayers that came too late, Ruth felt something shift inside her. The pattern was almost complete. 3 sisters dead, 1 remaining. And somewhere in the shadows of the manor, she could swear she heard the sound of familiar voices singing a lullaby that promised she would not be alone much longer. But Ruth was beginning to understand something her sisters hadn't. This wasn't random. This wasn't madness or weak hearts or nervous failure. This was deliberate, purposeful, planned. Someone, or something, was collecting the Morton daughters, and Ruth was the final piece of a puzzle. She was only just beginning to see. Tell me, have you ever felt like prey? Like something was hunting you with infinite patience, letting you run until you exhausted yourself, then closing in for the kill? Because that's exactly what Ruth felt as she stood over Clara's still form, knowing that next Christmas Eve would bring her own appointment with whatever darkness had claimed her sisters. The only question was whether she would face it as helplessly as Clara, or whether she still had time to learn why her family had been marked for extinction. The Morton manor stood like a tombstone against the winter sky. With 3 of its daughters buried in the family plot, the house seemed to exhale grief with every gust of wind through its empty rooms. Ruth walked those halls alone now, her footsteps echoing where once 4 sisters had filled the space with laughter and life. At 17, she had aged in the span of 3 Christmases. Her face, once round with youth, had sharpened into something harder, more watchful. The villagers crossed themselves when they saw her, as though she carried death's perfume on her clothes. Children no longer played their cruel songs. They simply ran when she appeared, their mothers pulling them close and whispering prayers. Charles had transformed in his grief. The military bearing remained, but something fundamental had broken inside him. He spoke to his dead daughters as though they were still sitting at the breakfast table, setting 4 places each morning and growing angry. When the servants tried to remove the extra settings, his prayers had become desperate, rambling conversations with a God who seemed to have stopped listening. "It's a test," he would mutter, pacing the library with its shelves of untouched books. "A test of faith, of obedience. We must not waver, Ruth. We must not question his plan." But Ruth was questioning everything. She spent hours in the manor's archives, pulling out dusty ledgers and yellowed documents, searching for some clue that might explain why her family was cursed. She found records of births and deaths going back centuries, accounts of the estate's management, correspondence with distant relatives who had long since forgotten the Morton name. Mrs. Redfern watched these investigations with growing unease. The old housekeeper had served the family faithfully for decades, but Ruth could see fear in her weathered face, fear of what might be uncovered, of secrets that were better left buried. "Some stones are best left unturned, Miss Ruth," she warned, hovering in the doorway as Ruth spread documents across the library floor. "Some truths are too heavy for young shoulders to bear." "Heavier than watching my sisters die," Ruth snapped, her grief sharpening her words like blades. "Heavier than knowing I'm next." Mrs. Redfern's face crumpled with something that might have been pity. "Perhaps," she whispered, "perhaps they are." The dreams had changed since Clara's death. Now all 3 sisters appeared to Ruth each night, standing in formation like pale sentinels. They no longer pointed or gestured, they simply watched her with eyes that held depths of sorrow Ruth couldn't fathom. Sometimes their mouths moved in unison, forming words she couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Soon," they seemed to say, "soon you'll understand." Winter deepened and the isolation grew complete. No visitors called at Morton Manor now. The postman left mail at the gates rather than approach the house. Even the local priest had stopped coming, claiming urgent duties elsewhere whenever Charles requested his presence. Ruth began to understand that she and her father were not merely mourning, they were quarantined. The village had decided that whatever plague of death surrounded the Mortons was contagious, something that might spread if they came too close. But isolation brought clarity. With no one to perform for, no social conventions to maintain, Ruth could focus entirely on the mystery that was devouring her family. She studied patterns, traced timelines, and mapped connections between events. And slowly, very slowly, a picture began to emerge. The deaths weren't random. They followed a specific order. Eldest to youngest, each 1 year apart, each on the holiest night of the Christian calendar. Someone was playing a game with very specific rules, and Ruth was beginning to suspect that the game had started long before Eleanor's first collapse. She found the first real clue in her grandfather's private papers, locked away in a strongbox she had to break open with tools from the stable. Among the routine correspondence and financial records was a series of letters that made her blood run cold. Letters discussing the Ray matter and the unfortunate necessity of maintaining silence. Letters that spoke of land acquired through regrettable but necessary accusations and the importance of letting sleeping dogs lie. Ray. The name meant nothing to Ruth, but it appeared again and again in her grandfather's correspondence, always in contexts that suggested shame, urgency, the need for secrecy. And in the margins of one letter, written in her grandfather's careful script, were words that stopped Ruth's heart. "May God forgive us for what we did to Elspeth Ray." Elspeth Ray, a woman's name, written with guilt and fear. Ruth had found her first real lead, the first thread that might unravel the tapestry of death surrounding her family. But before she could investigate further, Christmas Eve arrived with its familiar sense of doom. Charles had grown increasingly agitated as the date approached, alternating between frenzied prayer and dark muttering about God's justice. He had forbidden Ruth from leaving the manor, from speaking to outsiders, from doing anything that might provoke whatever force was stalking their family. Ruth, however, had made her own plans. She would not go quietly into whatever darkness had claimed her sisters. She would fight, investigate, discover the truth, even if it killed her. She had until midnight to solve a mystery that had been buried for generations. As the sun set on December 24, 1844, Ruth barricaded herself in the library with every document she'd found, every clue she'd gathered. If death was coming for her tonight, it would find her armed with knowledge. But the house had other plans. At 9 o'clock, the doors began slamming on their own. Heavy oak barriers that took 2 men to move swung shut with thunderous crashes, the sound echoing through the manor like cannon fire. The windows rattled in their frames despite the absence of wind. Candles guttered and died, plunging rooms into darkness that seemed to move and breathe. Charles found Ruth in the library, surrounded by scattered papers and flickering candlelight. His eyes were wild with terror and something that might have been madness. "It's time," he whispered, reaching for her with shaking hands. "Time to pay the debt. Time to join your sisters." "What debt?" Ruth demanded, backing away from her father's outstretched arms. "What did grandfather do? Who was Elspeth Ray?" But Charles was beyond conversation. He advanced on her with the mechanical precision of a man following orders he couldn't refuse. "The debt," he repeated. "The blood debt. It must be paid." Ruth ran. She fled through corridors that seemed to shift and change around her, up staircases that groaned under invisible weight, past windows that showed not the familiar moors but alien landscapes wreathed in perpetual fog. The manor had become something else, a trap, a maze, a hunting ground where she was the quarry. She found herself in the great hall as the clock began to chime midnight, and there, waiting for her in the shadows, stood her sisters. Eleanor, Margaret, and Clara, dressed in their burial clothes, their faces pale as moonlight. But they were not alone. Behind them stood a fourth figure, a woman Ruth had never seen before, yet somehow recognized, tall and gaunt, with wild dark hair and eyes that burned with an inner fire. Around her neck was a mark, a burn in the shape of rope, and when she smiled, Ruth saw centuries of patient hatred. "Hello, Ruth," the woman said, her voice like wind through a graveyard. "I've been waiting so long to meet you. I am Elspeth Ray, and I have come to collect what your family owes me." As the clock struck 12 and Ruth's world exploded into understanding, she realized that her investigation had been both too late and perfectly timed. Too late to save herself, but perfectly timed to finally learn the truth. The Morton sisters hadn't been victims of a curse. They had been payments on a debt that someone had thought buried and forgotten. And now it was Ruth's turn to pay. The sun rose on Christmas morning to find Ruth Morton still alive, though she wasn't entirely certain she should be. She lay on the cold stone floor of the great hall, her body aching as though she'd been beaten, her mind reeling with fragments of memory that felt more like a nightmare than reality. Elspeth Ray. The name echoed in her skull like a bell tolling for the dead. The woman's face remained burned into Ruth's vision, gaunt, terrible, beautiful, in the way that broken things sometimes are. But as daylight crept through the manor's windows, the supernatural terror of the night before began to feel distant, unreal. Has it happened at all? Or had grief and isolation finally driven her mad? Charles found her there an hour later, curled on the floor like a discarded doll. His face, when he saw her alive and breathing, cycled through confusion, relief, and something that looked uncomfortably like disappointment. "You're still here," he said, the words carrying strange weight. "Where else would I be?" Ruth struggled to sit up, her limbs heavy as lead. But Charles didn't answer. He simply stared at her with eyes that held depths of guilt she was only beginning to fathom, then turned and walked away, leaving her alone with questions that multiplied like shadows at sunset. Ruth spent the morning in a daze, trying to separate memory from hallucination. The documents she'd scattered across the library floor were gone, vanished as though they'd never existed. The strongbox that had held her grandfather's letters was empty, its contents erased as thoroughly as if they'd been burned. But the name remained Elspeth Ray. It lived in Ruth's mind now, demanding answers that the manor's walls seemed determined to withhold. By afternoon, desperation drove her to attempt what she'd never dared before, a journey to the village. Charles forbade it, of course. But Ruth was beyond caring about her father's prohibitions. She needed answers, and the only place to find them was among the people who had known the Morton family longest. Little Harwick greeted her arrival with the enthusiasm typically reserved for plague carriers. Doors slammed shut as she approached, windows darkened as though the very sight of her might bring contamination. Children were pulled from the streets so quickly that Ruth caught only glimpses of wide, frightened eyes before they vanished. The first person who would speak to her was Tom Miller, the blacksmith, and only because she cornered him in his forge where escape was impossible. "Please," Ruth begged, blocking his path to the door. "I just need to know about Elspeth Ray. What happened to her?" Tom's face went white as forge-heated iron. "That name," he whispered. "That name should never be spoken. Not by a Morton, not by anyone. Why? What did she do? What did my family do to her?" But Tom pushed past her with surprising strength for such an elderly man, muttering prayers under his breath as he fled. Ruth was left alone in the forge, surrounded by cooling metal and the scent of fierce sweat. Her next attempt was with Mrs. Whitmore at the bakery, then with the postmaster, then with anyone who wouldn't immediately run at the sight of her. But the pattern was always the same: recognition of the name Elspeth Ray followed by terror, denial, and flight. It was as though the entire village had agreed to forget something so thoroughly that even mentioning it could shatter their carefully constructed amnesia. Finally, as twilight began to settle over the moors, Ruth found herself outside the rectory. Father Walsh had been the village priest for 20 years, long enough to know its secrets, old enough to perhaps value truth over comfort. She found him in his study, hunched over a Bible that looked older than the church itself. When she spoke Elspeth Ray's name, he didn't flee. Instead, he closed the ancient book with shaking hands and looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. "I wondered when this day would come," he said quietly. "When someone would finally ask the right questions. Then you'll tell me what happened." Father Walsh was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled in his hearth. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Your grandfather was not a good man, Miss Morton. Oh, he was respected, feared even. But goodness and respectability are not the same thing. He wanted the Ray land, some of the best farming soil in the county. But Elspeth wouldn't sell." Ruth leaned forward, her heart pounding. "So what did he do?" "He destroyed her," Father Walsh said simply. "Accused her of witchcraft, of poisoning livestock, of consorting with dark forces. In 1795, when such accusations still carried weight, it was enough. She was tried, convicted, and executed." The words hit Ruth like physical blows. "Hanged on Christmas Eve. Left swinging from the old oak at the crossroads until the ravens picked her clean." Father Walsh's voice broke. "I was just a boy then, but I remember. The whole village turned out to watch. They said it was justice, but even as a child I knew better. I knew we were watching murder dressed up as righteousness." Ruth's mind reeled. "But why Christmas Eve? Why that specific night?" "Because your grandfather thought it would be symbolic. The triumph of Christian virtue over pagan evil. He was wrong, of course. Elspeth Ray was no witch. She was simply a woman who refused to be bullied by a powerful man. But by the time the truth came out, it was too late. She was dead. Her land was absorbed into the Morton estate, and the village had learned to keep its mouth shut about uncomfortable truths. Her last words, Ruth whispered, remembering fragments of her nighttime vision. Father Walsh closed his eyes as though the memory caused physical pain. She cursed the Morton line, swore that every daughter would die as she had died, on Christmas Eve alone and afraid, until the debt was paid in full. The pieces clicked together in Ruth's mind with terrible clarity. The pattern of deaths, the specific timing, the way each sister had suffered before dying, it all made horrible sense now. "How many?" she asked. "How many daughters has she claimed?" "3, by my count. Eleanor, Margaret, Clara." Father Walsh looked at her with infinite sadness. "And you should have been the 4th. The fact that you're sitting here alive, it troubles me more than I can say." Ruth felt cold fingers walking down her spine. "What do you mean?" "Curses have rules, Miss Morton. They follow patterns, complete themselves according to their own logic. If Elspeth Ray wanted 4 daughters dead, and you survived when you should have died," he shook his head, "it means something has changed. Something I don't understand and frankly don't want to." Ruth left the rectory with her mind spinning. The truth was worse than she'd imagined, not a supernatural curse born of genuine evil, but human greed dressed up as justice. Her family had built their fortune on murder, and now the bill was coming due in blood. But why had she survived? What made her different from Eleanor, Margaret and Clara? And more importantly, was she truly free, or was this simply a reprieve before the final act? As she walked back toward the manor through gathering darkness, Ruth became aware of footsteps behind her, not human footsteps. These made no sound on the frozen ground, but she could feel them nonetheless, a presence that matched her pace and seemed to grow stronger as the distance to the house decreased. She didn't turn around, she didn't dare, because she suspected she knew who was following her, and she wasn't ready to face those burning eyes and rope-scarred neck again. Not yet. But soon. After all, debts this old don't simply vanish because one payment was missed. They accumulate interest. They grow hungry. And Elspeth Ray had been patient for so very, very long. Ruth returned to Morton Manor that night with the weight of her family's sins pressing down on her shoulders like a gravestone. The truth was a poison in her veins, spreading through every memory of her comfortable childhood, tainting every fond recollection of her grandfather's stories and her father's pride. The Morton fortune, their respectability, their standing in the community, their very identity, was built on theft and murder. Elspeth Ray had died for the crime of refusing to surrender her birthright to a man who decided he deserved it more. Mrs. Redfern was waiting in the kitchen when Ruth entered, her ancient face creased with worry. The old housekeeper took one look at Ruth's expression and knew immediately what had transpired. "So you've learned the truth at last," she said, her voice heavy with resignation. "You knew. It wasn't a question. All these years you knew what grandfather did and you said nothing." Mrs. Redfern's hands twisted in her apron, gnarled fingers working the fabric like worry beads. "What good would telling have done? The dead cannot be brought back to life, child. Secrets cannot resurrect the innocent or punish the guilty once they've gone to their own judgment. But my sisters, your sisters paid the price for sins they never committed. Yes, just as you would have if..." Mrs. Redfern trailed off, her eyes growing distant. "If what?" Ruth pressed. "Why didn't I die last night? What makes me different?" The old woman was quiet for so long that Ruth thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because you're not just a Morton child. Your mother..." She paused, seeming to wrestle with herself. "Your mother was a Ray." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. "What?" "Elizabeth Ray was Elspeth's great niece, the last of the bloodline, or so we thought. Your father met her in London, where she'd gone to escape the shame of her family name. She never told him who she really was, took her stepfather's surname, created a new history for herself. But I knew. I recognized the eyes, the way she hummed old songs, the shape of her hands. Ruth sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "You're saying my mother was related to the woman whose grandfather was murdered?" "Not just related. Elizabeth was Elspeth's direct descendant, the inheritor of everything that was stolen. When she married your father, she brought the Ray bloodline back into Morton Manor, and when she died birthing you..." Mrs. Redfern's voice cracked. I think she knew what was coming, what her daughters would face. The implications crashed over Ruth in waves. She wasn't just paying for her grandfather's crimes, she was both victim and heir. Morton and Ray, the convergence of a blood feud that had simmered for generations. "The curse," Ruth whispered. "It's not just punishment, it's reclamation." Mrs. Redfern nodded grimly. "Elspeth Ray wants her land back, her name restored, her blood acknowledged. She's been taking the Morton daughters one by one, but you..." She studied Ruth's face with ancient eyes. "You carry both bloodlines. You're the key to ending this one way or another." "How?" Ruth demanded. "How do I end something that's already cost 3 lives?" But Mrs. Redfern had no answers, only warnings about the danger of stirring forces beyond mortal understanding. Ruth left her in the kitchen and climbed the stairs to her room, her mind reeling with the revelation of her true heritage. She was a Ray as much as a Morton. The blood of the murderer flowed in her veins alongside that of the murderer. No wonder Elspeth's spirit had spared her. Ruth wasn't just another victim to be claimed, she was family. That night, the dreams came more vividly than ever before. But this time, Ruth wasn't a passive observer. She found herself standing in a moonlit field, surrounded by 4 figures in white. Her 3 sisters stood in formation, their faces serene but sorrowful. And beside them, no longer terrible but achingly sad, was Elspeth Ray. "You understand now," Elspeth said, her voice like wind through autumn leaves. "You know why they had to die." "They were innocent," Ruth protested. "They never harmed you, never even knew you existed." "Innocent?" Elspeth's laugh was bitter as winter frost. "Your sisters lived in luxury built on my bones. They wore jewels bought with my blood. They slept in beds warmed by fires fed with wood from my stolen lands. Tell me, child, is ignorance the same as innocence?" Ruth had no answer. How could she argue with a woman who'd been wronged so completely, so cruelly? "But you're different," Elspeth continued, circling Ruth like a predator studying prey. "You carry my blood as well as his. You could choose differently than your family has chosen." "What choice?" Ruth asked, though part of her already knew. "Acknowledge the debt. Restore what was taken. Give the Ray name the recognition it deserves." Elspeth's eyes burned with an inner fire. "Or join your sisters in paying the price for your grandfather's sins." Ruth looked at Eleanor, Margaret, and Clara, seeing them clearly for the first time. They weren't trapped or suffering. They were waiting for her to decide whether justice would finally be served or whether the cycle of payment would continue. What would acknowledgement look like? Ruth asked carefully. "Simple," Elspeth smiled, and for a moment her face was beautiful rather than terrible. "Renounce the Morton name. Reclaim the Ray inheritance. Tell the world what really happened in 1795. Give me back my voice, my story, my truth. And if I refuse..." Elspeth's expression hardened. "Then you'll die as your sisters died, and I'll wait for the next generation, and the next until someone finally pays what's owed." Ruth woke with the choice burning in her mind like a brand. She could save herself by destroying her family's reputation, or she could die to preserve a legacy built on lies and murder. But as dawn broke over the moors, illuminating the familiar landscape she'd loved since childhood, Ruth realized the choice wasn't really about her own life or death. It was about truth versus comfortable fiction, justice versus stability, the rights of the dead versus the convenience of the living. She thought of Eleanor's cold authority, built on wealth that had never rightfully belonged to her, of Margaret's intelligence, used to manage estates stolen through false accusations, of Clara's gentle nature, supported by luxuries paid for with an innocent woman's life. They had been good people, her sisters, but they had also been willing beneficiaries of an ancient crime, just as Ruth had been until she learned the truth. The question wasn't whether Elspeth Ray deserved justice. She clearly did. The question was whether Ruth had the courage to be the one who finally delivered it. And as Christmas approached once more, Ruth began to understand that her survival hadn't been a reprieve. It had been preparation for a choice that would define not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone who had profited from her family's buried sins. The dead were patient, but they were also persistent, and Elspeth Ray had been waiting almost 50 years for someone with both the knowledge and the bloodline to make things right. Ruth was that someone. The only question now was what she would choose to do about it. December 1845 arrived like an executioner's hood, black, suffocating, inevitable. Ruth had spent the year in a strange state of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor completely resigned to death. She walked through the days like a woman underwater, everything muffled and distant, waiting for Christmas Eve to arrive and force her hand. The village had grown even more hostile toward her. Word of her visits to the rectory had spread, and with it came whispers that she was stirring up old troubles and disturbing things better left buried. Shopkeepers refused her custom. The postman no longer came at all. Even the doctor, when summoned to treat Charles's increasingly erratic behavior, would only stand in the doorway and shout his diagnoses from a safe distance. "They're afraid," Mrs. Redfern explained as she served Ruth's solitary breakfast. "Afraid that acknowledging what happened to Elspeth Ray will bring judgment on the whole village. They all watched her die, child." Every man, woman, and child in Little Harwick stood silent while an innocent woman swung from that rope. Charles had deteriorated rapidly since Ruth's survival the previous Christmas. He spoke constantly to his dead daughters now, setting places for them at every meal, buying them Christmas gifts that accumulated in their empty rooms like offerings to ghosts. His prayers had become incoherent rambling, mixing scripture with personal pleas and strange confessions that made Ruth's skin crawl. "Forgive us our trespasses," he would mutter, "as we forgive those who trespass against us." But what if the trespassing never stops? What if the debt keeps growing? Eleanor understands. Margaret sees the necessity. Clara knows why it had to be this way. Ruth began to suspect that her father knew more about their family's curse than he'd ever admitted. His guilt seemed too specific, too focused on particular sins rather than general moral failing. But whenever she tried to question him directly, his eyes would go blank and he'd start reciting military drill commands, as though retreating into memories of a simpler time when right and wrong were clearly defined. As Christmas approached, Ruth made her decision. She would not flee. She would not hide. She would face whatever came on Christmas Eve with full knowledge of what her family owed and what payment might be demanded. But she would do it on her terms, not as a victim, but as someone who understood the true nature of the debt being collected. Ruth spent the days before Christmas documenting everything she'd learned. She wrote detailed accounts of Elspeth Ray's life and death, of her grandfather's crimes, of the curse that had claimed her sisters. She prepared letters to distant relatives, to newspapers, to anyone who might listen and spread the truth once she was gone. Because Ruth had come to understand that her survival the previous year hadn't been mercy, it had been recruitment. Elspeth needed someone to tell her story, and who better than a member of the family that had silenced her? Ruth's death would be meaningless without context, but her testimony, properly preserved and distributed, could restore Elspeth's name and reputation even if it destroyed the Morton legacy in the process. On the morning of December 24th, Ruth sat in the library surrounded by her written testimonies and made peace with her choices. If she died that night, It would be Elspeth Ray's voice, as much as the Morton family's final victim. If she lived, well, she wasn't entirely sure what living as both murderer's descendant and victim's heir would mean. Charles found her there, as the sun began to set, his face haggard and his eyes bright with fever or madness. "It's time," he said, the same words he'd spoken the year before. But this time there was no menace in them, only exhaustion. "Time to finish what we started. Time to pay what we owe." "You knew," Ruth said, not looking up from her writing. "You've always known about Elspeth Ray." Charles laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Known, child. I was there. 7 years old, holding my father's hand as we watched her swing. He told me it was justice, that God demanded righteousness from his people. But even then, I knew we were watching something evil be done in the name of good." Ruth's pen stopped moving. "You were there when she died." "I was there when she cursed us." Charles sank into a chair, suddenly looking far older than his years. "She spoke your name, Ruth. Before the rope tightened, before her voice was stolen forever. She looked directly at my father and said, 'The last daughter will bear my name as well as yours, and she will choose between blood and gold, between truth and comfort, between justice and family.' Then she smiled, and they pulled the cart away, and we all pretended we hadn't heard a prophecy spoken by a dying woman." The implications staggered Ruth. She knew, 50 years before I was born, she knew I would exist. The curse was never about revenge, child. It was about choice. Eleanor, Margaret, Clara, they died because they would never have chosen differently than their grandfather. They were too much Morton, too little Ray. But you, Charles studied her with eyes that held depths of sorrow. You carry both bloodlines equally. You're the fulcrum on which this entire tragedy balances. As if summoned by his words, the manor began its familiar transformation. Doors slammed shut, windows rattled in their frames, and shadows gathered in corners where shadows had no right to exist. But this time, Ruth felt no fear. This time, she was ready. She gathered her written testimonies and walked to the great hall, Charles following behind like a man walking to his own execution. The clock on the mantel showed 11:45, 15 minutes until the anniversary of Elspeth Ray's death. They waited in silence as the minutes ticked away. At 11:59, the air in the hall began to shimmer, and 4 figures stepped out of the darkness. Eleanor, Margaret, and Clara stood as they had in Ruth's dreams, serene and patient in their white burial gowns. But beside them stood Elspeth Ray herself, no longer terrible but magnificent in her righteous anger. "You've made your choice," Elspeth said, her voice carrying the authority of the grave. "I have," Ruth replied, holding up her written testimonies. "I choose the truth. I choose justice. I choose to give you back your voice, even if it costs me everything." Elspeth smiled, and for the first time, Ruth saw not a vengeful spirit, but a woman who had waited 50 years for someone to simply acknowledge that she had existed, that she had mattered, that her death had been wrong. "Then the debt is paid," Elspeth said, "not in blood, but in truth, not through death, but through courage." The clock struck midnight, and Ruth braced for whatever would come. But instead of pain or transformation, she felt only a great weight lifting from her shoulders. The shadows that had haunted Morton Manor for generations began to fade, and with them went the oppressive sense of guilt and dread that had poisoned the very air. Eleanor, Margaret, and Clara stepped forward, their faces bright with something that might have been relief or gratitude. They each touched Ruth's hand briefly. A blessing, a farewell, a passing of responsibility from the dead to the living. Then they were gone, taking Elspeth Ray with them into whatever realm awaited those whose business in the world was finally finished. Ruth stood alone in the great hall, clutching her testimonies and trying to comprehend what had just happened. The curse was broken, but not through death or sacrifice. It had been broken through acknowledgement, through the simple act of bearing witness to an old injustice and choosing to speak for those who had been silenced. Charles, however, had not been spared. Ruth found him the next morning collapsed before the fireplace with his lips foaming and his eyes wide with terror at something only he had seen. The guilt that had eaten him alive for decades had finally claimed its due, leaving Ruth truly alone in the world. But for the first time since Eleanor's death, alone didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like freedom. Ruth woke on Christmas morning to a world transformed. Sunlight streamed through the manor's windows with a clarity she hadn't experienced in years, as though some invisible film had been stripped away overnight. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on Morton Manor since Eleanor's death was gone, replaced by something Ruth couldn't quite name. Not peace, exactly, but the absence of active malevolence. She was alive. That fact struck her with surprising force as she stood over Charles's lifeless form in the Great Hall. After 4 years of Christmas Eve deaths, after accepting that she too would join her sisters in the family plot, Ruth Morton Ray was breathing, thinking, feeling the steady rhythm of her own heart. But something fundamental had changed in her during those midnight moments when Elspeth Ray had accepted her offering of truth. Ruth caught sight of herself in the hall mirror and gasped. Her reflection was faint, translucent, as though she existed only partially in the physical world. When she held up her hand, she could see through it to the wallpaper beyond. She was alive, but barely. Suspended between the world of the living and whatever realm had claimed her sisters. The curse was broken, but Ruth had paid a different price than death. She had become something neither fully mortal nor completely spectral. The implications became clear over the following days. Food tasted like ash in her mouth. Sleep brought no rest, only a strange floating sensation, as though her soul was trying to slip free of her body. When Mrs. Redfern came to lay out Charles's body, the old woman looked directly through Ruth, as though she weren't there. "Miss Ruth," Mrs. Redfern called, searching the empty rooms. "Miss Ruth, where have you gone?" Ruth stood directly in front of her, speaking her name, but the housekeeper showed no sign of hearing or seeing her. It wasn't until Ruth concentrated with tremendous effort that she managed to become visible enough for Mrs. Redfern to notice. "There you are," the old woman said, though her eyes remained slightly unfocused, as though Ruth were a mirage that might vanish at any moment. "I was worried you look so pale, child, so thin." Ruth understood then that her survival had come with conditions. She existed in a liminal space, visible to the living only when she chose to be, solid only through conscious effort. The barrier between life and death had become permeable for her, allowing her to slip between states as easily as walking from room to room. It should have been terrifying. Instead, Ruth found it liberating. She was free from the constraints that bound ordinary mortals. Free to go where she pleased, to learn what she needed to learn, to complete the work Elspeth Ray had set before her. Her first task was distributing the testimonies she'd written. Ruth discovered she could travel vast distances simply by willing herself to be elsewhere, appearing in the offices of newspaper editors, the homes of distant relatives, the studies of church officials who had tried to bury the truth about Elspeth Ray. Each revelation was met with shock, denial, and eventual acceptance as Ruth provided evidence that could not be disputed. Letters in her grandfather's own hand admitting to false accusations, legal documents showing how the Ray lands had been seized, witness accounts that had been suppressed for 50 years. The scandal spread through the county like wildfire. The Morton name, once synonymous with respectability and Christian virtue, became associated with corruption and judicial murder. Some demanded the family fortune be returned to Elspeth's descendants, though none could be found. Others called for the church officials who had supported the execution to be defrocked. But Ruth's favorite victory was the smallest and most personal. She appeared to the village children who had once taunted Clara with their cruel rhymes and taught them a new song, one that told the true story of Elspeth Ray and honored her memory. Soon young voices throughout Little Harwick were singing about the innocent woman who had been murdered for her land, and how her courage had finally brought justice to light. The work consumed months. Ruth moved through her strange half-existence like a woman possessed, driven by the need to restore every shred of Elspeth's reputation, to undo every lie that had been told about her death. She testified at hearings, provided evidence to investigators, and spoke to anyone who would listen about the real history that had been buried beneath decades of comfortable fiction. But even as she celebrated each small victory, Ruth was aware that her time was growing short. Her connection to the physical world was weakening. Some days she could barely maintain enough substance to turn the pages of a book. Other times she would forget she had a body at all, and wonder why people couldn't hear her thoughts. Mrs. Redfern, loyal to the end, stayed at the manor and pretended not to notice when Ruth flickered in and out of visibility during their conversations. The old woman had taken to leaving Ruth's favorite meals on the table each evening, though they remained untouched. Ruth could no longer process earthly food, sustaining herself on something more ethereal. "You can't keep this up forever, child," Mrs. Redfern said one evening as Ruth materialized in the kitchen like morning mist taking shape. "You're fading more each day. Soon you won't be able to come back at all." Ruth knew she was right. The boundary between existence and non-existence was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Sometimes she would spend hours trying to remember her own name, or wonder why the manor felt like home when she could barely recall living there. But she wasn't finished yet. There was one final task that needed completing, one last piece of Elspeth Ray's story that demanded telling. The truth about her own choice, and what it meant for others who might face similar decisions between family loyalty and moral courage. By autumn of 1846, Ruth's testimonies had spread far beyond the borders of Dorsetshire. What had begun as a local scandal had transformed into something much larger, a symbol of how power could corrupt justice, how comfortable lies could bury uncomfortable truths, how the sins of one generation could poison the next. Newspapers across England carried accounts of the Morton family's crimes and Elspeth Ray's vindication. Church officials launched investigations into historical cases of suspected false accusations. Legal scholars debated the implications of evidence that had been deliberately suppressed for decades. Ruth watched it all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and growing detachment. Each day brought her closer to complete dissolution, her consciousness becoming more like smoke than substance. She could still manifest physically when necessary, but it required tremendous effort and left her exhausted in ways that mortal tiredness couldn't compare to. The manor itself had begun to change in response to her fading presence. Rooms that had been closed for years suddenly opened their doors. Sunlight reached corners that had been shrouded in shadow since Eleanor's death. The oppressive atmosphere that had characterized Morton Manor for generations was lifting, replaced by something lighter and more peaceful. But Ruth's most important work was yet to come. She had begun receiving visitors, people who had heard her story and sought her counsel. They came to the manor in the early morning hours when the boundary between worlds was thinnest, drawn by rumors of a woman who existed between life and death and could speak truth that the living dared not voice. There was Mary Blackwood, whose husband beat her nightly, but whose family refused to intervene because he was wealthy and respected in their community. Ruth appeared to her like a guardian angel and provided evidence of the man's financial crimes that allowed Mary to escape with both her life and her children's inheritance. Thomas Gray sought her help when his business partner was slowly poisoning him to steal their shared company. Ruth gathered proof that would have taken living investigators months to uncover, appearing in locked offices and sealed records rooms to document the crimes being committed. Most memorably, there was young Sarah Pemberton, barely 14, and being forced into marriage with a man 3 times her age by parents who cared more about social advancement than their daughter's welfare. Ruth appeared to Sarah in dreams and waking visions, teaching her to read legal documents, showing her how to contact relatives who could offer shelter, providing the knowledge needed to escape a fate worse than death. Each intervention drained Ruth further, but she couldn't stop. She had learned something from Elspeth Ray's example, that death wasn't the end of responsibility, that being silenced didn't mean accepting silence, that justice delayed could still be justice delivered if someone was willing to pay the price. Word spread through networks of servants, traveling merchants, and desperate souls seeking hope. They called her the Grey Lady, the ghost of truth, the spirit of justice. She became legend and rumor, story and salvation, feared by those with guilty consciences, and beloved by those who had nowhere else to turn. But legends exact their own toll. Ruth found herself remembering less and less of her mortal life. The faces of her sisters blurred in her memory. Her own reflection became increasingly difficult to summon. Sometimes she would spend days as pure consciousness, floating through walls and landscapes without form or substance, only to suddenly remember she had once possessed a body and struggle back to partial physicality. Mrs. Redfern tried to anchor her, speaking constantly about shared memories, showing her portraits of the family, reading aloud from letters Ruth had written. But even the faithful housekeeper was aging, her own health failing as she devoted her remaining strength to caring for someone who barely existed. "You have to choose, Miss Ruth," she said one evening, as Ruth flickered like a candle in a draught. "You can't stay suspended between worlds forever. It's not natural. It's not kind. To yourself, or to those who love you." Ruth understood what she meant. Her half-existence was becoming a burden rather than a blessing, a refusal to accept the natural order that was causing more pain than healing. But how could she abandon the work that Elspeth Ray had entrusted to her? How could she stop fighting for those who had no other champion? The answer came, as answers often do, from an unexpected source. Ruth was investigating a case of judicial corruption in a neighboring county when she encountered another spirit, not vengeful like Elspeth had been, but peaceful and purposeful, the ghost of a magistrate who had spent his afterlife quietly correcting the injustices he had been too weak to prevent in life. "You think you're the only one?" he asked when Ruth expressed surprise at meeting another liminal being. "Child, there are dozens of us scattered across England. Spirits who couldn't rest while wrongs remained unrighted, souls who chose purpose over peace." He led her to others, the ghost of a woman who had died in a workhouse and now protected other vulnerable souls from similar fates, the spirit of a soldier who had been executed for desertion and spent his afterlife exposing military corruption, the shade of a physician who had been silenced for speaking truth about industrial diseases and now worked tirelessly to protect public health. Ruth realized she had become part of something larger than herself or even Elspeth Ray's personal quest for justice. She had joined a hidden network of spirits who served as guardians, investigators, and advocates for those who had no earthly protection. But she also realized that this network had its own rules, its own prices, its own terrible responsibilities. "The choice isn't between existing and not existing," the magistrate explained as they stood together in a courtroom where he had once failed to prevent an innocent man's conviction. "The choice is between holding on and letting go, between continuing to serve and accepting that your service has limits." Ruth understood. She could remain in her liminal state indefinitely, helping individual cases but gradually losing herself in the process. Or she could choose to complete her transformation, becoming something more than human but less than the woman she had been. The decision, when it came, was easier than she had expected. Ruth Morton Ray chose to let go of her mortal identity completely, accepting transformation into something that could serve justice without being constrained by the boundaries of individual existence. She became legend, story, inspiration, the ghost of Morton Manor, who appeared when innocence was threatened and truth needed to be told. But that transformation would come at Christmas, on the anniversary of Elspeth Ray's death and her own supernatural rebirth. One final Christmas Eve to complete the circle that had begun with a hanging in 1795. Christmas Eve, 1846. Exactly 1 year since Ruth had faced Elspeth Ray in the Great Hall and chosen truth over family loyalty. The manor stood silent on its hill, most of its rooms empty, most of its secrets finally exposed to light. Mrs. Redfern had passed quietly in her sleep 3 weeks earlier, her work complete, her final duty discharged. Ruth had appeared at her bedside in those last moments, solid enough to hold the old woman's hand and whisper thanks for a lifetime of faithful service. They both knew it was goodbye, not just to each other, but to the last connection Ruth had to her mortal existence. Now she wandered the empty halls alone, her form flickering between substance and shadow, as she prepared for the final transition she knew must come. Her work in the physical world was finished. Elspeth Ray's reputation had been restored, the Morton family's crimes acknowledged, justice served in ways both public and personal. But Ruth's existence as a liminal being was becoming increasingly unstable. She could feel herself fragmenting, pieces of her consciousness scattering to the winds like leaves in autumn. Soon she would lose coherence entirely, becoming nothing more than wisps of memory haunting empty rooms. Unless she chose differently. The other spirits had explained the process to her. On significant anniversaries, moments that held special power in the supernatural realm, beings like Ruth could undergo complete transformation. They could shed the last vestiges of individual identity and become something larger, more enduring, more useful to the cause they served. Ruth would cease to be Ruth Morton Ray, a specific person with particular memories and individual desires. Instead, she would become a force of nature, a principle given consciousness, an aspect of justice itself that could manifest wherever and whenever innocent blood was threatened. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it brought peace. As midnight approached, Ruth made her final preparations. She wrote one last letter, not with pen and ink, which her ghostly hands could no longer manipulate reliably, but with will and intention, words appearing on paper through sheer force of determination. The letter was addressed to future generations, to anyone who might wonder what had become of the last Morton daughter, and why her name lived on in whispered stories. In it she explained her choice, her transformation, her hope that others facing similar decisions would find courage in her example. "I was given a choice between comfortable lies and difficult truths," she wrote, "between family loyalty and moral courage, between preserving the past and creating a better future. I chose truth, courage, and hope. The price was everything I thought I was, but the reward was everything I could become." Ruth sealed the letter with her remaining essence and placed it where future visitors to the manor would find it, on the mantelpiece in the great hall, beside Elspeth Ray's vindication documents and her own testimonies about her family's crimes. Then she waited. The transformation began at the stroke of midnight, just as the church bells in Little Harwick began their Christmas chimes. Ruth felt her individual consciousness start to dissolve, her specific memories and personal desires melting away like snow in spring rain. But instead of terror, she experienced profound relief. The burden of existing between worlds was lifting. The exhaustion of maintaining form and substance was ending. She was becoming something simpler and simultaneously more complex, not Ruth Morton Ray the person, but justice the principle, truth the force, courage the inspiration. As her transformation completed, Ruth's final coherent thought was gratitude. Gratitude to Elspeth Ray for choosing redemption over revenge, to her sisters for their unknowing sacrifice, to Mrs. Redfern for her unwavering loyalty, to all the spirits who had shown her that death need not mean the end of purpose. Then Ruth Morton Ray vanished forever, replaced by something that had no name but countless functions. The Grey Lady began her eternal work that very night, appearing to a young woman in London who was about to be murdered by her husband for her inheritance. Then to a child in Manchester whose factory overseer was planning to eliminate witnesses to his safety violations. Then to a servant in Bath who had discovered her employer's plans to frame an innocent man for embezzlement. The stories spread across England like ripples in a pond. a ghostly woman who appeared to those facing injustice, who provided evidence that living investigators couldn't gather, who protected the vulnerable and exposed the corrupt. She had no fixed form, no permanent residence, no individual identity. She was simply justice given consciousness, truth empowered to act, the promise that some wrongs would not go unanswered. The Morton Manor stood empty after Ruth's transformation, its windows dark, its halls silent. But travelers passing by on Christmas Eve claimed to see lights in the windows and hear the sound of voices singing carols. Four sisters reunited at last, their harmony finally free of discord. The village of Little Harwick eventually learned to speak Elspeth Ray's name with pride rather than shame. They erected a memorial where she had been hanged, acknowledging her innocence and the injustice of her death. Children grew up knowing the true story, understanding the difference between lawful execution and judicial murder. But the most lasting change was less visible and more profound. The Grey Lady's legend inspired others to choose difficult truths over comfortable lies, to speak for those who had been silenced, to refuse complicity in systems that protected the guilty at the expense of the innocent. Ruth's sacrifice had ripple effects that spread far beyond her individual story, touching lives that would never know her name but would benefit from the courage her example inspired in others. And in quiet moments when justice seemed impossible and truth appeared defeated, those who listened carefully could sometimes hear an echo of four sisters' voices singing together, a reminder that love endures beyond death, that truth survives every attempt to bury it, and that courage, once kindled, can light fires that burn across generations. The Morton family's Christmas curse had ended not with death, but with transformation. Not with punishment, but with purpose. Not with an ending, but with a beginning that would last as long as there were wrongs to be righted and voices that needed to be heard. Ruth Morton Ray was gone, but the Grey Lady would endure forever. A ghost story with teeth. A legend with purpose. A Christmas tale that reminded listeners that the most powerful transformations often require the greatest sacrifices, and that sometimes choosing to haunt the world is the most loving thing a spirit can do. Epilogue. They say that on Christmas Eve, when the wind is just right and the moon hangs full over the moors of Dorsetshire, you can still hear them singing. Four voices in perfect harmony, carrying across the frost-covered fields a carol that no one can quite recognize but everyone somehow knows. The Morton Manor stands empty now, and has stood empty for decades. But the stories persist. Stories of a woman in grey who appears when justice hangs in the balance, who speaks for those who have been silenced, who ensures that some debts, no matter how old, how buried, how forgotten, will eventually be paid. Children in Little Harwick grow up, knowing both versions of the tale, the Christmas curse that claimed four sisters, and the Christmas choice that transformed the last daughter into something more than human, but no less loving. And sometimes, just sometimes, when faced with their own impossible decisions between loyalty and truth, between comfort and courage, between what is expected and what is right, they remember Ruth Morton Ray's example and find the strength to choose differently than their fear would dictate. The Grey Lady endures because the need for her endures. As long as the powerful prey upon the innocent, as long as comfortable lies threaten difficult truths, as long as some voices are silenced while others speak too loudly, she will continue her work. Ruth learned something that Christmas Eve in 1846, something that echoes still through the empty halls of Morton Manor. Love is not about holding on. Love is about letting go when letting go serves a greater purpose. She let go of life to serve the truth. She let go of individual identity to serve justice. She let go of everything she thought she was to become everything her world needed. And in that letting go she found a kind of immortality that no curse could claim and no grave could contain. The Christmas bells still chime in Little Harwick each December 24th. But now they ring not just in celebration of one birth long ago, but in remembrance of one transformation more recent, the night a young woman chose to become a legend, and a legend chose to become hope. Ruth Morton Ray is gone, but the Grey Lady remains, and will remain, as long as there are stories to tell and wrongs to right and voices that need to be heard. Some ghosts, after all, are exactly what the world needs. What do you think? Would you have made Ruth's choice? When faced with the decision between preserving your family's comfortable lies or exposing their terrible truths, which would you choose? Because somewhere in the space between this story and your own life, that choice might be waiting for you too. The Grey Lady is always listening, and she remembers everyone who finds the courage to speak when silence would be easier. Sleep well.